All right. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anna Edgerton. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg. I cover tech policy and national security. Very interested in artificial intelligence these days. I hope you all are too. First of all, thank you to ACLI to Invariant for hosting this webinar. I was glad to see y'all were the sponsors of the ACLI Capital 5K today. I was not pleased to see that some of your teammates passed me, but it's good to see y'all here. So this is the first webinar in Invariant's Tech Talk series. We're going to explore some of the artificial intelligence policy landscapes. We've got a few different jurisdictions to cover: California, here in Washington, what's going on over in Europe, and we've got some great experts that'll kind of talk us through this. It's a perfect time to be having this panel. We saw Sam Altman and Christina Montgomery from IBM in the Senate yesterday, so I'm sure we're gonna have a lot of interesting discussions. So we're going to look at some of the global challenges, also the history of artificial intelligence. We know that there's been a lot of increased interest in this technology since some of the generative AI apps have become more broadly used in recent months, but companies have been working with this technology for a long time. So I'll be interested to hear y'all's perspectives on this. So on our panel today, we have Joel Richard and Sam Love. They co-lead Invariant's technology practice group. We also have Ben Greenstone. He's the founder of Taso Advisory, a technology public policy consultancy with offers in Brussels, Dublin, and London. And Cynthia Guerrero is a partner and on the management committee at California Strategies, a top public affairs team in California. So I want to just kick this off by kind of looking more broadly at the policy landscape across different jurisdictions. Wanted to start with Washington. So Sam and Joel, if y'all could kind of start us off by talking about what's going on here regarding AI policy.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Anna, for hosting, and to Ben and Cynthia for joining us today to provide a really global and state perspective. And Anna, sorry for not stopping to say hello as I passed during the 5K today.
Okay, thanks, Joel.
Yeah, I think to start, I think, again, we couldn't be at a better time to have this discussion with the hearings kicking off this week. There are 3 AI hearings scheduled for this week. The Senate Judiciary Committee yesterday was extremely notable in terms of laying out the framework and sort of seeing where member interests lie. We saw interesting proposals about creating a new agency, exploring some ways to build out transparency and interconnections to the privacy debate and Section 230 debate as well. So a really interesting hearing. And then I'll turn it over to Sam to talk about some of the other landscape moments.
Yeah, thanks, Joel, and Anna, thanks again for doing this, and Cynthia and Ben for joining today. To Joel's point, obviously very interesting time in AI. I think I would point out in terms of the need to know is that while it seems like a really new conversation in Congress, it is certainly not. Going back to 2016 when Ted Cruz was subcommittee chair at Senate Commerce and held a hearing on AI, the first sort of congressional hearing on AI, where actually Greg Brockman from OpenAI testified. There's been a long history of interest in this issue in Congress. I think, ChatGPT has really sort of supercharged the conversation around this and certainly driven a lot of member interest given press attention on these issues. But, from the Obama administration's work on these policies to the Trump administration's Office of Science and Technology policies work, to NIST risk management framework and, conversations around a national AI research resource, there's no shortage of items out there in the policy space from both the congressional and administration perspective that have sort of been bringing us to this point, which is, look forward to chatting a little bit more in detail on how that history is bringing us to where we are and where we expect things to go.
And I'll also add just one more piece to follow on there in terms of coming out of the hearing yesterday. In the background, there's also Majority Leader Schumer's effort around developing a new framework. So that's one that we've been hyper-focused on with a lot of our clients. They're watching how the Majority Leader is approaching his own effort as the administration has really led the way so far from this perspective.
Yeah, and we've seen other agencies weigh in as well. Lena Khan had her op-ed in the in the New York Times, Homeland Security has weighed in on how they can use AI and everything from like supply chain to drug trafficking. So definitely a lot of interest from the administration and also Congress. Once again, we have the EU kind of leading the charge here on regulation, obviously finalizing the AI Act. So Ben, could you kind of walk us through what we should expect for Europe and what that means for AI companies?
Yeah, sure. And I think there's actually sort of a related point to the one that Sam made, that this hasn't all just kicked off with ChatGPT. You know, the AI Act was initially proposed a little over 2 years ago, and there was lots that led to that. But as you say, the AI Act is it's awaiting its plenary vote in the Parliament, to use the parlance. But it's not far off being finished, I think, is the basic truth. The broad strokes of the act are final. You know, there's not really a whole lot of room to change the guardrails and the sort of boundaries of the act, but there are some details still being worked on, and we'll be going to trilogue soon, which is the negotiation between the 3 European institutions, the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission, where some of that detail will be hashed out. So we're expecting at the latest in Q1 2024, but probably at the end of this calendar year, that the AI Act will essentially be finalised and get put into the EU's official rulebook. We've got the Spanish presidency starting in July, and they're very, very keen to have it happen under their presidency of the Council. But then also, you mentioned Europe. Taking continental Europe, the UK, of course, has its own separate approach now, and the UK is taking this really different approach to what is quite prescriptive and clear that the EU has taken. So the UK has gone for what they're self-styling a pro-innovation approach, which is essentially hands-off. We think there are a few key principles that we need to think about. So the adaptivity and the autonomy of systems, and then things like fairness and accountability. But that we're going to leave AI regulation mostly to individual sectoral regulators. So, you know, the medical regulator will take an approach to AI, the financial regulator will take an approach to AI, and so on. So that's a much more hands-off approach. I'm not sure that will hold 12 months into the future. I think there are too many calls for some proper action, not least, as you mentioned, from the CEOs of companies involved in AI. But that's sort of where we are on our side of the pond.
Mm-hmm. Ben, if I could just follow up to ask a scope question. One thing that we saw in the most recent debate is kind of questioning this risk-based approach that the AI Act took initially, in light of kind of the generative AI technologies that we've seen come out. Is that, you know, the kind of the ChatGPT question, has that changed the scope of what we're talking about?
I think it's certainly expanded the scope of what people are thinking about. Whether or not it will meaningfully change the detail of the act, I think remains to be seen. I'm sure there will be some additions, but I don't think that what we're expecting, what the EU hasn't historically done, is, you know, got a year or two into a piece of work, had some new information and said, right, let's go back to the drawing board and start again. The EU, generally speaking, takes we'll get the thing done and we can revisit it if we need to approach.
Well, and that's the perfect illustration of why, you know, tech regulation in general is tough, because you have innovation just far outpacing, you know, government, certainly here in Washington, but also, you know, there's a process. Tech development, don't wait for the process to play out. Cynthia, wanted to come to you on California. Obviously, California is usually out front when it comes to regulating technology, and that's certainly been the case in the debate here on AI. What's going on in Sacramento? Who are the main players? What should we be paying attention to?
Thanks, Anna. Excuse me. Thanks, Anna. I agree that California is known for moving ahead and setting policy, much because the environment demands it. It is known for innovation. It has the GDP the size of a country, but also a full-time, very active legislature. The state of play in California AI policy is that there are actually 4 bills that are moving through different phases of the legislative process. We have 2 bills in the Assembly and 2 bills in the Senate. But the bill everyone is watching is AB 331, which was introduced by Assemblymember Bauer Cahan, which would establish an AI framework based on the White House blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights. The California Chamber of Commerce is doing an excellent job spearheading a business stakeholder conversation and addressing this bill, which is somewhat perceived like almost an AI omnibus bill. The proposed legislation targets multiple areas that could be impacted, from employment, education, housing, to the utilities industry and financial services, with the biggest concern being with the creation of a private right of action. The coalition includes various businesses, technology trade groups, but also looking at the other side of the argument in favor of the proposal are groups like the California Hawaii State Conference of the NAACP, which filed official support stating that automated decision-making tools have been found to exhibit biases and consequently have resulted in discriminatory impacts on marginalized communities.
And that's a great illustration of why there needs to be some kind of regulation on this. Needs to be some kind of guardrails. We see, at least here in Washington, you have like the NIST framework, which is largely about what companies can do themselves. And then you have the White House Bill of Rights, which is a set of kind of protections and rights for consumers. So you can see California kind of looking at both and thinking how you can protect against the worst kind of abuses and make sure consumers know at least what they're dealing with when it comes to this technology. Speaking of Washington, we're often playing catch up here in DC when it comes to regulating, especially the tech industry. So Joel and Sam, do you think that is in fact the case? Like what can policymakers here do, kind of given the pace of legislating, to keep up with this industry?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Anna. I guess I'd start just by respectfully disagreeing with the premise that necessarily catching up when it comes to regulation is either the right policy move or right for U.S. innovation and U.S. economy. And I think this is something that a lot of people are sort of struggling with. And I think there's this tension right now from the regulatory perspective about existing regulatory authority and what more may be needed. We're seeing the Federal Trade Commission, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the CFPB, and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division coming together on a joint memo, sort of this unprecedented discussion about how they have all the tools they need to regulate in this space. I think there's a question, about what that's going to mean in the shorter and medium term. Republicans in Congress have obviously not been fans, despite some of them having voted for the chair at the Federal Trade Commission, of what that agency is doing. And so I think you can expect, depending on how the chair wants to pursue, enforcement action in this space, some hesitation among some Republican members of Congress. But Republicans are also not at this point, saying this needs to be a Wild West and let anyone do what they want. They're talking about looking at some common sense guardrails as well. Congressman Obernolte from California yesterday published an op-ed talking about this very thing, talking about the need for companies to be transparent about what they're doing with consumer data and how they're using that and what they expect to do with that. And so there's going to be this ongoing conversation. I think, it's really important, I think, in conversations I've had with policymakers and staff, that we're not falling into this idea that this is a competition about how to restrict artificial intelligence. I think this is a competition about how to grow artificial intelligence responsibly. And I think that is really squarely where a lot of Republicans have been within Congress. And so certainly more to come on that front, but maybe I'll kick to Joel for a differing or complementary perspective.
No, sure. I think I certainly, I agree with you, Sam. We're aligned there. But I think I would just note another aspect of the debate that maybe I would push back on in terms of the general narrative, and that's about Congress's expertise or lack of understanding about the technology and where to go next. I think there are a lot of really smart, hardworking staffers on the Hill who do get this and have a long background. And I think one thing that lends itself to that critique in the media is that maybe a 5-minute question round is not the best place to articulate a nuanced policy position or priorities there. So I think that's one thing I would push back on, and something that we've heard from staff is that, as Sam mentioned, Rep. Obernolte has an advanced degree in artificial intelligence and machine learning, and that far outpaces the general population to have one member of Congress with that level of expertise. And we have other members of Congress, Representative Beyer from Virginia, who's also pursuing his own education. So I think while there's real genuine interest among staffers who aren't as deeply involved in the background of the technology, it provides a good opportunity for our clients to go in and have these conversations. You can find folks who do get it and who do understand the importance of innovation and continuing that alongside protecting folks in terms of the harms that we might expect down the road.
And we saw some thoughtful questions in the hearing yesterday. You could tell that there was a lot of interest in the underlying technology of this. I think the kind of restriction there is the cooling saucer of the Senate. It's legislating is designed to be slow and deliberative and to seek consensus. So when you get to addressing a fast-moving industry, there's an interplay there, which we're seeing in the EU and is certainly the case here in the US. Sam, did you want to jump in as well?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think you're going to see, conversations in the Senate, I think, revolving around some key areas, things related to transparency, though there are questions around transparency to whom, and questions, around sort of research. That's been something that's been a focus of folks in the Senate as well. And so going to be only more of a robust debate, I think, going forward there.
Mm-hmm. Well, and kind of thinking about the data privacy discussion as informing this, we heard yesterday a lot of senators saying, we understand that this technology is important, it's going to be transformative. We didn't really meet the challenge when it came to social media, have not yet met the challenge when it comes to the most basic data privacy protections at the federal level. And that's one place, Cynthia, where California has really led. The interesting about California's data privacy actions is that they've kind of been the first mover in this space, which, and then we saw several other states follow suit, but adopting a slightly different model, maybe calling it like the Virginia, Colorado, Connecticut privacy model. And I'm wondering where you see this playing out when it comes to AI. Is California being the first mover going to be kind of the trendsetter for the rest of the states or even the federal government, or is it going to be kind of an outlier?
Yeah, well, California usually is definitely leading the way and could possibly set that quasi-national standard. We are expected to be moving in that direction, much because of the consequence of our legislative calendar and the state's legislature's ability to move more quickly than Congress. As we even heard, since we're talking a bit about the federal hearing yesterday with Senator Blumenthal, he did say that Congress expects to have a series of hearings to follow and be very deliberative on developing this federal AI oversight. California is attempting to work in parallel with Congress and the White House, but I do believe that they are going to be setting the tone in terms of what is possible. We could see a bill signed into law as early as 5 months. And similar to the privacy policy, as you mentioned, Anna, California could be leading the way. The discussions are going to be thorough. The author of AB 331 is taking the process very seriously by inviting various stakeholders and experts to the table, which includes scientists and scholars in the AI space. So that's kind of the state of affair there.
Great. And before, Ben, I've got a question for you on Europe, but I did want to remind everyone that the Q&A function down at the bottom here is open. So if you have questions, toss them in there and we'll see if we have time to get to them at the end or work them into our discussion. Ben, I wanted to come to you on Italy because when ChatGPT was first rolled out, Italy was very quick out the gate to say, we don't want this technology, but then pretty quick to reinstate it. So just asking for your thoughts on that episode and whether there was anything that was kind of missed in the reporting as that played out.
Sure, and I should say I'm going to have to rely heavily on guidance given to me by my colleague Simone, who heads our Brussels office and is Italian. So the sort of the read is a few things, I think, which is that you're right, Italy did essentially ban ChatGPT, but not because it's AI, but because of concerns over potential breaches of the GDPR, which is of course Europe's data protection rules. And so there was this sort of concern that ChatGPT and OpenAI had breached the GDPR, which was the ban, rather than because it's AI. There's then this sort of second thing that's worth noting, which is that the Italian privacy regulator and Italy in general have always been very, very concerned about privacy, even more than sort of Europe in general. Sort of in terms of norms, Italy is among the most privacy conscious of the European member states. And the third thing, and maybe a bit of conjecture here, but it came along at sort of very similar time to lots of complaints from Italian administrators and sort of educational institutions about the use of ChatGPT at a time when lots of Italian exams were taking place. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there that I think, you know, without being facetious about it, you know, it's not we're going to ban AI. It's a concern about how some of these systems are created and how the input for those systems comes to be in possession of companies. And I think we're going to see much more of that. Just yesterday, the French privacy regulator said that they were going to be looking at this. In the UK, the sort of de facto AI regulator is our data regulator. So we're going to see much more of that, and we might not see sort of as many knee-jerk bans, but we'll see lots of privacy regulators looking at this.
Well, as we were discussing before we started, I was a high school teacher before I was a journalist, so I totally understand the teachers' fears about this technology. I was just dealing with like smartphones starting to become a thing, and it was like definitely a thing. So I can only imagine like, you know, AI on your smartphone. That's in an effort to make this kind of as practical as possible and as useful as possible for people who are listening in, I wanted to ask about kind of how you're advising clients. Joel and Sam, you know, we have a lot of people, a lot of companies, not just developing AI, but also thinking about integrating these tools into existing products. So wanted to see how you're advising clients, you know, what kind of advice you're giving them as we're still in a bit of an uncertain policy environment.
Sure. Thanks, Anna. I think, you know, this moment is certainly full of risks and opportunities for stakeholders in this space. And I'll take this moment to give Ben a shout out on his podcast. He opens with, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, which is something that I've heard our CEO and founder, Heather Podesta, say often. So it's important to be engaged in this moment. And in terms of advising our clients, one place we've really directed folks to is the Schumer effort. So I think that's somewhere, I think the majority leader has really taken input from academics in the space and some business stakeholders as well, a few trade associations, it sounds like, from before the release of his framework announcement. But there's a lot more to do there. So we've definitely encouraged clients to go in and talk to the Schumer team and engage there. And I'd also be directing folks to watch the development of the new Chinese government competition package, that framework that chairs and ranking members in the Senate are having discussions around as well. We've seen repeatedly through the hearing yesterday and other statements concern about competition with China in terms of the United States continued innovation and competition for AI technology.
And I think we'll hear a lot more about that tonight when the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition with the Chinese Communist Party has their hearing at 7 p.m. tonight. Joel, if I could follow up on that, do you have any guidance for us on kind of timing of what you expect? You know, is the Schumer framework on AI something that you expect to see develop like throughout the year, this year into next year? And the same question for the Chinese competition framework.
Yeah, we haven't seen firm timelines. I think I'll start with the China competition effort. I think they're taking a broad approach there and really seeing what's possible. I think, you know, we've been through competition bill 1.0 and seeing what's left. I think funding will be an issue, right? We're running into the debt ceiling now, and we'll see what appropriations look like through the rest of the year. But funding could be an impediment to that effort. So I think it will develop in a longer term fashion. And then in terms of the AI framework itself, Senator Schumer said in his press release that he wants to move quickly. I think that release came just after the Chinese authorities released their regulation. So there's an effort of sort of keeping pace there that's on the majority leader's mind. But we don't have any firm timelines. And I think there's certainly an opportunity over the next few weeks and months to get in and have those important discussions.
Great. Sam, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say to the point on opportunities and risks and associated with the timeline, I think the opportunity, for clients and people out there tracking these issues is that members of Congress are eager to act. And I think the risk is that members of Congress are eager to act. They are two sides of the same coin here. And I think that there is a strong interest on the Hill to hear from people who are engaged in these issues in the day-to-day and have the real world experience. One of the challenges out there in terms of a risk for companies and for legislators and regulators, you look to New York City, for example, and they have this automated employment decision tool rulemaking they've put forward. They've had to delay it several times. There was a bill passed at the city council level, but implementation and actual real world working of that regulation has been really unclear, and they've had to take a couple of swings at this. And so there is always the risk that regulators and lawmakers get this wrong. And so I think the opportunity there is for companies in the private sector to be making clear sort of how this would impact and how something, in the legislative regulatory space might play out in the private sector. And so as far as a timeline on activity from Capitol Hill, agree with Joel. I think the items to watch, as they always are bipartisan areas of cooperation. And so I think there's going to be a lot of people on both sides of the aisle introducing bills that don't yet have bipartisan support. Senator Scott introduced an AI related bill yesterday about social media companies and restrictions for parental controls. So I think, that doesn't yet have Democratic support, but I know there's an interest, obviously, from members on both sides of the aisle to find bipartisan areas. So we're certainly watching discussions in the bipartisan frame, and we expect those to be continuing to produce legislative items of note.
Oh, Sam, I've got a question that I think is probably going to be a good one for you from from our Q&A chat. We've got someone wondering how likely you think it is that there will actually be a creation of a new AI agency, as was discussed at length yesterday in the hearing with Sam Altman and Christina Montgomery. I talked to Blumenthal after the hearing and to kind of flesh out that idea a little bit more and to see whether this is going to be like a new government agency that we're talking about. Is this like a newly empowered Federal Trade Commission with the resources and technologists needed to perform this kind of regulatory function? Do you see this as an actual reality that we should be tracking, or is this kind of more in the theoretical level at this point?
I mean, I certainly would never want to disparage any members thinking that something is going to be reality. After all, they're the ones with the pens in their hand, and they can make it a reality if they're able to find the support within Congress. And so I think that's always a risk out there. In terms of what's happening on the ground, I think, there's a lot of hesitance, I think, within Republican circles in both the House and the Senate, and particularly House Republicans, around the idea of creating some kind of new government agency, particularly within this administration. I think there's been concerns about how the administration has acted on a whole host of fronts among Republicans. I think it would probably have a hard time getting out of the House. I think there are also probably some committees, including one, the Senate Commerce Committee that I worked closely with when I was on Capitol Hill, that, I think would have something to say about other committees kind of stepping into jurisdictional places. But, certainly an idea, I think, is, given that there was bipartisan support thrown behind it, that's worth watching. I think there's a long road, at least now, in order to get it done. And the regulators themselves are saying at the FTC and elsewhere that they have what they need. And so it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
And, like you pointed out before, there are rules in place that the agencies we have can enforce. So, there are existing statutes that, apply to AI. So it'll be interesting to see how those, current enforcement authorities are used in this new area. Ben, if I could come to you with the same question on kind of how you're advising clients, what does it look like from Europe, and how are you kind of helping people and companies navigate that landscape?
Sure. So I guess, I mean, in terms of practical reality, let's go and talk to as many people as we can who are involved in shaping the rules. In the UK, that has varied as interested parliamentarians through to the relevant ministers, and then a whole range of government bodies. And as I said, there's this sort of delegation down to sectoral regulators. So it will depend very much until the sector a client is operating in. And in the EU, we're looking very much at the relevant committees, relevant commission departments, directorate generals, and then the sort of officials within them. But sort of more generally, I think the way we're thinking about how to engage on this is split into the clients that are applying AI to their existing business and clients who are perhaps sort of AI first. And I think the messaging, the kind of stories you want to tell the stakeholders are quite different depending. Our clients who are deploying AI to their long-standing businesses, it's much more a story of sort of ethics and principles and how this is additive and it's not going to destroy a whole load of jobs, and people aren't going to find themselves in some Minority Report style future. And for clients who are more AI first, there's and I've heard both Sam, Joel, and Cynthia talk about this throughout this sort of let innovation happen message, rather than let's very carefully and sensibly apply this new technology to our existing business models. And those are two quite different messages. So so we're thinking about that a lot for those clients.
And Ben, we've got one question from the Q&A that I think might get your thoughts on. Yesterday in the hearing, we heard talk about, Sam Altman brought up the idea of whatever kind of licensing requirements or regulation we have in this space should be global, because there are other countries, companies around the world that are working on this. What are the chances of having some kind of like global governance of this? Is that a realistic goal? Is that something that we should be discussing?
At the risk of looking really stupid in a not very long period of time, I'll make an actual bet, which is that I don't think that we'll get to that stage for a few reasons. I think first, there's quite good recent precedent of a lack of willing, generally speaking, for global cross-border consensus on technology regulation. I think content regulation, for instance, has been a really good example of that. So has competition regulation. We've seen some quite pointed barbs back and forth on things like the Digital Markets Act and in the UK, the Digital Markets Unit, because they target the kinds of business that America is very good at creating and that the UK and the EU are less good at creating. And I think we've talked a bit about China, but I think the China element here makes it even harder than it otherwise would be, partly because this is sort of so obviously a technology of strategic importance in a way that I think we might suggest that Facebook was less so, although I'm sure there'd be lots of people that would argue that Facebook was strategically important. And I think what we've seen on standards bodies, I've seen Jane's question, I think what we've seen on standards bodies over the last five years at least has been a concerted effort from China to stack those international standards bodies with Chinese representation or with representation that is sympathetic to China. And so generally speaking, international standards organizations, I think, have seen a sort of a lessening in their standing in lots of Western countries, certainly. And so I'll be really surprised if we end up with an international coalition on this that sits above national authorities.
That's a really good point. And we also see kind of the struggles of existing multilateral agreements, whether it's on arms controls or whatever. Countries are pulling out of those. We're not making more of those. This is not a moment where you're seeing kind of increased global cooperation. Although, Sam Altman in the hearing yesterday did make the point that maybe it's not as crazy as it sounds, because the U.S. companies do have a lot of control over the computing power and the GPUs that are required to run these systems. So there is an element of kind of using the supply chain and using the computing capacity to bring other countries to the table and kind of direct the conversation.
I guess the only other thing I'd add, I think it's a good point, is that the EU and the US haven't managed to find an agreement on data transfers across the Atlantic that hasn't been struck down yet. Max Schrems is still going to Max Schrems for a while yet. So, like I said, I just think that precedent suggests we're not going to get there.
Okay, well, I'll mark Ben down as being a pessimist on that. Cynthia, same question for you on how you're advising clients, especially in California. Home of Silicon Valley, the origin of a lot of this innovation, but also one of the most progressive states when it comes to regulation. So a really interesting place for you and your clients to be.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for the last 2 decades of working with emerging technology companies, I've emphasized to clients the importance of getting ahead of a problem, particularly those in that have a B2C or B2G model. It's necessary to understand how a predominantly progressive legislature with strong consumer laws approach business oversight. A starting point is education. I absolutely agree with Team Invariant and their amazing CEO, Heather Podesta, that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. In this case, that's very, very important. We have 120 members introducing anywhere up to 2,500 bills per year. So it's imperative to take control of the narrative before somebody else does. And this is essential risk mitigation approach for any company looking into doing business in the state of California, and even those exposed to federal risk implication, since California does and can move more quickly than the federal government.
And that's a great point, that this is not just a conversation for technology companies, but this is potentially a technology that's going to affect the entire economy. This is as we saw in the data privacy discussion, almost lots of companies are data companies. We're not just talking about Google and Meta and Amazon or whatever. We're talking about banks and healthcare organizations and advertisers, and a lot of this technology is going to come into that conversation as well. So if we could just do kind of a quick roundtable on something that you think people aren't aware of but should be, any kind of under the radar trends or developments that you're following. I guess, Joel, if we could start with you, anything that's on your mind?
Sure. Yeah, I think this kind of harkens back to some of the points we made earlier in terms of the intersection between the AI policy debate and privacy. I mean, some of these things have been going on for a long time. The Algorithmic Accountability Act was first introduced in 2019, and some of those provisions around bias and civil rights protections were worked into the ADPPA, the bipartisan privacy proposal that was advanced out of the Energy and Commerce Committee last Congress. So I think that's one place to pay attention in terms of where Congress goes on privacy, possibly more energy around that issue and maybe something more ripe to follow along with. But that's one direction I'd point people to.
Great. Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the conversation around technical standards, we mentioned international cooperation. I think, the government angle of that has become increasingly difficult, particularly given China's role. However, on the industry side of things, ISO has been looking at AI technical standards since 2017. They were meeting through COVID, having conversations about this space. It's incredibly complex, and I don't think that we're anywhere near having a lot of clarity around how those technical standards would be put into practice, or things like, for example, third-party audits that have been discussed. Without technical standards, it's pretty tough to audit against something that doesn't yet exist. And so I think there's more to come on that front. And it'll be interesting to see sort of how that continues to interplay with the legislative and regulatory approach on this as well.
Yeah, and I know kind of agreeing on global standards, or at least transatlantic standards, is going to be a big issue at the Technology and Trade Council meeting in Sweden end of the month. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. Ben, anything on your radar that is kind of underreported, undercovered?
Yeah, I don't want to say it's underreported or undercovered, but certainly something that I find myself talking about less. Is that, and I think in a way that is different to the US as I've understood it from clients, is that in the EU and the UK, our creative industries, so film, music, publishing, all of that kind of stuff is much better represented, much more organized, and much more loved by policymakers. It's often talked about as the great British export, right? And I think we're going to see an awful lot more than we've seen yet of debate and going beyond debate. I mean, Getty have taken Stability and Stable Diffusion rather to Stability AI to court over this of how these models have been trained, and we've had some sort of infighting in the UK government on this as well, with our intellectual property office getting really, really close to allowing text and data mining for model training without having to buy licenses, essentially, that got knocked down at the last minute. But I think that's something that this is going to be sort of a rude awakening for a bunch of these businesses.
And again, that came up in the hearing yesterday in a very American way when Marsha Blackburn was like, I represent Tennessee, Nashville, country music. We had AI creating a song in the style of Garth Brooks, and in our little chat with my editors, we're like, oh boy, when we have to protect Garth Brooks, that's when you're really going to get the regulation. So yeah, that's an excellent point about protecting content creators and intellectual property and copyright. Cynthia,
just to jump in real quick on
yeah,
the point is the Copyright Office
on Garth Brooks.
Mostly on Garth Brooks, but also the Copyright Office in the States today is having another in their listening sessions around audiovisual works. So they've worked through some of the sort of literary works, and then they're going to do a music session later. But they've had like 5 or 6 listening sessions around copyright and the impact on AI. Oh, that's great to have on your radar. News you can use, guys. Joel Richard right here. Cynthia, same question for you. Anything we should be paying attention to?
Absolutely, and that's a great question, Anna. But again, dovetailing on the commentary of my colleagues here on the Zoom webinar is that, again, intellectual property rights and the unintended impact of that. Again, there's no way to actually credit original creator for its content, and it could pose legal risks, including, as we discussed, intellectual property infringement.
Mm-hmm. So one last question for all of y'all, and then we'll see if we get any more questions from listeners. How would you advise organizations that are trying to build AI into their operations? Looking at this from a political or policy perspective, as this is becoming a more important part of the way we interact with all different kinds of products. Any kind of last words of advice for clients or for other companies out there? Joel, go ahead.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So we certainly had a lot of interest from a lot of our clients who are already using their own AI and machine learning processes, and then now integrating some of the more generative and topical tools. I think our advice has been to reference. I think the AI risk management framework that NIST put out is a great resource there. We've had clients who are working through their own responsible AI governance and principles, developing those and sort of making sure that their internal processes are where they're comfortable is really the best place to focus at this point.
If I could add another question to that as we kind of go around the room. If you have any examples of how clients are using AI in interesting ways, not just generative AI, but all the other AI tools, I'd be interested in just some concrete examples of what this looks like. Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, and happy to follow up on that piece too. But I think, to follow on to what Joel is talking about, the importance of the NIST risk management framework really can't be understated. I think, Senators Hickenlooper and Blackburn sent a letter a few weeks ago to some organizations around town, sort of talking about the importance of companies looking at this and asking sort of how companies are interacting with the NIST risk management framework. So definitely an important one to keep an eye on. I think in terms of being mindful that Congress moves very slowly, except when it doesn't. And bad behavior is oftentimes a catalyst for very quick bipartisan movement. And so, to Joel's point, of our clients and those out there in industry who are already thinking through their own, voluntary internal impact assessments, thinking about the ways in which their tools are being developed, the ways in which they're deploying tools, are really going to be critical as Congress keeps a magnifying glass on this issue going forward.
Great. Ben.
I think mostly to reiterate the points earlier about, this is an opportunity, this moment in certainly the UK and to a lesser extent the EU, but certainly still in the EU, for businesses to go and say, we're responsible actors and you can trust us and we'll tell you how this stuff can work. That sounds really cynical, but actually, there is a need for businesses to go and explain this stuff to politicians and officials. It's why all of us on this call who do public affairs, right? It's not generally speaking a dark art. I think it's an opportunity to facilitate conversation between the two. And I mean, I guess the other thing, and we say this to clients all the time about policy and public affairs generally, not just in AI, is don't wait for it to happen to you. Businesses are very good at waiting until it's a crisis and then doing something about it. But this is a good example of a moment where there's a chance to get out ahead of something to help shape what a future regulatory landscape might look like for both AI first businesses, but also, as you said, Anna, businesses that are across the whole economy that will implement AI solutions. So more of that, I think.
Great. And Cynthia.
Yeah, I mean, companies can mitigate political and policy risks simply by addressing the algorithmic biases that are at the front end of engineering, mitigating those discoveries, and reviewing content for potential harm can also, help bolster trust and safety mechanisms, in addition to assessing societal impact. Being prepared to answer these questions to lawmakers as the technology evolves is going to be essential.
Mm-hmm. Great, and we've got one question in our Q&A, and if anyone else wants to jump in on the Q&A, this is your chance. A question about it looks like regulatory capture. If there is a new agency created or an existing agency kind of imbued with more regulatory powers over artificial intelligence specifically or technology more generally, how do you prevent the companies that are supposed to be answerable to this new agency from kind of capturing the agency and setting the agenda there? And I guess related to that question, I would also ask about just the idea of the gatekeepers, the big tech companies that are out front developing this technology. How do we ensure that I know there's something that's on a lot of lawmakers' minds, ensure that smaller startups have a chance to participate in this new economic opportunity. Joel, let's start with you.
Sure. I think, we've seen this play out a bit in terms of the calls for a moratorium on AI development and who would that benefit? That question has certainly been out there. And then who would benefit from a stronger regulatory framework? And it's certainly maybe some of the bigger players. Another piece of this is the ongoing debate around open source versus closed and which is safer and which is more responsible. That's a debate that's ongoing as well. I think in terms of establishing a new agency, there's so many headwinds to getting to that point in terms of resources and where we go next. I think that's less of a concern at this point, but seeing what happens with the FTC and their efforts is really where I'd focus people on those regulatory impacts.
Great. Sam?
Yeah, and I think that linkage between big tech and concerns around regulatory capture definitely carries a lot of weight on both the Republican and Democratic sides of the aisle. Increasingly, you've seen members on both sides with concerns about consolidation across industries, and this isn't related just to tech. I think this is industries more writ large, and so those are definitely conversations lawmakers have been having. I think in terms of what resources may exist out there for smaller businesses, I hate to be a broken record on the NIST AI risk management framework, but that's one of those ways in which the government is looking to try to help companies conceive of where to place their resources, which in many cases for these small businesses are really constrained, and what can have the biggest impact in looking to mitigate risk and bias. And I would say, secondly, another idea that's been out there was a report that was commissioned in the National AI Initiative Act of 2020, which was folded in, I believe, into an NDA a couple of years ago. But a report just issued in January 2023, and this is about the National AI Research Resource, or NAIR, and there are conversations about, what makes sense from the federal government's perspective, from the National Science Foundation and other entities who are engaged in this, sort of create data repositories or opportunities for small businesses to take federal data and things that are otherwise publicly available and put them into an easily accessible location as people are looking to train data sets and build their own tools. So Congress has definitely spoken on these issues. I think, we'll see where that goes and whether members want to pick that up and make it more formal, but definitely an area of interest and a bipartisan one at that.
Great. We're just about at time, but I wanted to give Joel and Sam the opportunity, if you have any closing thoughts on government relations or public affairs more broadly. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think everyone knows this, but the energy around this topic is so high at this point. You can't walk around the Hill at this point and run into anybody who isn't willing to talk about these issues. The events this week with Sam Altman on the Hill, it sounds like they were oversubscribed and full rooms with folks who are, getting members in a room like that can be hard to do, but more folks that showed up than RSVP'd. So that's a notable piece. And so I think that energy is certainly there. And then another event that was on the Hill is some researchers from MIT met with folks, and you have Hakeem Jeffries and Speaker McCarthy together kicking off an event like that. So it's time to get engaged. This is an important opportunity to educate folks. And I think I would also link this back to some of the comments we heard at the hearing yesterday around the perceived failure to sort of address some of these privacy, social media harms, and how AI can actually address some of those things. So there's a component here where AI can improve cybersecurity, improves privacy, and highlighting some of the AI for good type use cases is worth pursuing as well.
Yeah, would echo the AI for good piece, and the innovation aspect of this is going to be really critical. And in terms of the congressional interest in this, we've talked about the Senate Commerce Committee, we've talked about Senate Judiciary and that hearing, and the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. We haven't talked about a whole host of other committees that have AI jurisdiction or want to. The China Select Committee, or the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. We have the House Science Committee. There's a whole host of committees in Congress that want to engage on this and have engaged on this in real ways and had successes that have been signed into law. And so definitely expect there to be a continued focus moving forward. I think we'll see a series of hearings at these committees in the months to come. And so only more from here. And again, I think, members of Congress and their staff are eager to learn and eager to hear information from people on all sides of this debate. And I think that a movement toward responsible AI is where Democrats and Republicans are really trending toward. Obviously the devil's in the details, and we'll see how things shake out, but there's an interest in getting this right. And the conversation is really in a high gear at this point.
I think that's a great point to end on, because we see, the interest in this is not just from every congressional committee, which I definitely hear being up on the Hill. There are a lot of people who want to engage on this and want to talk about it, and you want to talk about not just kind of the trendy things that we see, but also kind of the fundamentals of this technology and how it can be applied more broadly. And you see that across the government. Like I said, different agencies, Homeland Security, the Federal Trade Commission, the White House for sure, speaking on this, weighing in on how and how this will play out. And we also see this in the states, like Cynthia explained. California is not going to be the only state working on this, although certainly generally one of the first movers, but other states are going to weigh in with their own regulation as well, especially as until we have anything concrete coming from the federal government. And the EU and Europe more broadly definitely leading on this as they usually do. So it was just great to get kind of that global perspective here. I really appreciate y'all taking the time. Thanks again to Invariant for having this event, and there'll definitely be more to talk about in this space. So that's all. Plan to follow up soon.
Sounds great. Thank you, everyone.
Anna, thanks everyone.